The first conscious shock. It has been noted that when an individual tries to remember themselves, they must also remember their aim. When a person remembers the work within them and their aim in it, then at the same time looks out at life, this act of self-remembering brings the work up to the point of entry of impressions. It enables us to take incoming life from a work point of view, then notice the reactions we are about to make, preventing impressions from falling on the customary places in us, and producing our habitual reactions. All this involves a struggle between yes and no. A person in such a state can see an impression about to produce a typical response in them, and say yes to it, or they can say no to it. If the response that the impression is about to cause is contrary to the individual's aim, and the person says no to it, then they are keeping their aim. They are working on themselves, and in that moment, they have sacrificed something. What have they sacrificed? The satisfaction of reacting as usual, mechanically, the satisfaction, say, of feeling aggrieved, or the satisfaction of some unpleasant thought, some unpleasant manifestation, and so on. This is the true meaning of sacrifice and not animals or humans being slaughtered at some altar. It involves a struggle at our inner altar, which is very quick, and does not show itself externally, for the benefit of others. It takes place within a person and has to do, using their inner assent, or inner refusal. It takes place where a person should be conscious, where they should be awake, and where, actually, they are asleep. This place can be found, and is the place where the first conscious shock is given. Everyone should always remember their aim, when they remember themselves. A person cannot develop, unless they remember themselves, for their point of development is precisely at that point where they remember themselves. It is here, at this point, where someone can struggle consciously. For an individual to develop, a struggle must be set up in them, a struggle between yes and no, a struggle between aim and not aim. But everything will depend on the nature of this struggle, upon what the person struggles for, and what they remember as yes and what as no. Upon this, the result of the struggle depends. As a rule, there is no struggle in a person's inner life. In a mechanical thing, one who does not remember themselves, a person of routine who reacts mechanically to their surroundings, in their own acquired way, who goes with all of their acquired habits, there is no inner struggle. A struggle only begins when we go against our routine, our mechanicalness, which we imagine that we follow from our will. But if a struggle does begin within us, especially if there is a continued and definite line in this struggle, then gradually, more and more, permanent traits begin to form in us as we follow new and different neurological pathways. What kind of permanent traits begin to form will depend on the nature of the struggle and upon what is yes and what is no. We may have a hard life, we may have to deny ourselves, to struggle with great adversity, hardships and so on, and as a result, permanent traits may begin to form in us. But it does not follow that these permanent traits are desirable or useful to our right development in the work. They may indeed very easily stand in the way of any real inner development. That is, before we can develop correctly, these permanent traits may have to be dissolved, and a new starting point made, which may be impossible. A fanatical belief can cause permanent traits to form in an individual so strongly, that what is called in this system crystallization, takes place in them. Something crystallites out in a person, something hard in the sense of its being unyielding, and permanently fixed. This word crystallization is the term used in the work to describe some degree of inner fusion of qualities, which can often be observed in the aged. One meaning of the saying of Christ, "Except ye turn and become as little children, ye shall in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven," Matthew chapter 8, verse 3, is that one meeting this work must always turn back and begin again, owing to the wrong ideas and attitudes, the wrong development life has given us, and this is all the more difficult if there is some degree of crystallization in us. That is so, when more or less permanent traits have been formed. Crystallization can take place for different reasons. For example, fear can set up a struggle in a person. They may struggle in order to overcome fear, in order to show they are not afraid. Or they may struggle because they are terrified of failure. They may struggle because of some punishment they dread, such as fear of sin, or fear of hell and retribution. In the latter case, they may struggle with themselves with the greatest violence, and as a result crystallize out. What is the basis of this crystallization? The basis is fear. The fear of sin, of hell, can both evoke a terrible internal struggle, between yes and no, but if a person crystallizes out on this foundation, then they crystallize in the wrong way. Fear is not a right basis for crystallization. It is not only a wrong, but an incomplete crystallization, for in right crystallization, all that is useful and capable of growth in an individual must be included. Fear is negative, and such a person will not possess any further possibilities of development, such as they are. For a further development to take place, they must first of all be melted down, and this can only be accomplished through terrible suffering and trauma. Through a tremendous, life-altering external shock. All this basis of fear must be removed. What is the result of wrong crystallization? It means that something so permanent and so resistant is formed in a person that it may survive death and may once more enter into the world in another material incarnation. This is because a certain inner fusion has taken place through the friction of the struggle between yes and no. But, as was noted previously, friction through the struggle between yes and no can easily take place on the wrong foundation and result in a wrong, incomplete crystallization. In other words, crystallization is possible on any foundation, either good or bad, the result being a certain psychic permanence, capable of resisting and surviving death for a certain time, and even of incarnating into another physical body, re-entering life. For example, someone may crystallize out on the basis of revenge or hatred, and through denying themselves everything that does not aid their possibilities of revenge and hatred, they may form something permanent in them that can exist after the death of the physical body, something very dark and foreboding. Speaking of this possibility of psychic crystallization on any foundation, a teacher once said, "Take for example a brigand, a really good, genuine brigand. I knew such brigands in the Caucasus, who will stand with a rifle behind a stone by the roadside for 8 hours without stirring. Could you do this? All the time, mind you, a struggle is going on in them. They are thirsty and hot, flies are biting them, but they stand still. Another is a monk, he is afraid of the devil, all night long he beats his head on the floor and prays. Thus crystallization is achieved. In such ways, people can generate in themselves an enormous inner strength, they can endure torture, they can get what they want. This means that there is now in them something solid, something permanent. Such people can become immortal, however, what is the good of it? Someone of this kind becomes an immortal thing, although a certain amount of consciousness is sometimes preserved in them. But even this, it must be remembered, occurs very rarely. In the above two examples, we can see how in the first case, someone can crystallize wrongly with an ordinary life aim, and in the second, with a so-called religious aim. For right crystallization to take place, the struggle between yes and no must be on a higher level of understanding. A person must not crystallize in small parts of centers, or in negative parts. They must first gain possession of right knowledge, and then begin to understand it, and apply it, to themselves. Unless they are given right knowledge and begin to understand and apply it, they will not know what they must struggle with, and they may indeed start to struggle with something that will only do them harm. In this regard, it is interesting to note what the work teaches us to begin to observe, and to struggle with. We can see that what is important to grasp is the quality of the struggle of yes and no. What quality, what kind, of yes and no does a person remember, when they remember themselves? If someone remembers all that they understand of the work and its teaching, then the quality of their yes and no, in their inner struggle with themselves, their sacrifice at the inner altar, will be right, and if crystallization begins in them, on the foundation of this work, it will be a right crystallization. Is to be conscious in a hydrogen then, a work phrase? To answer, it is necessary to think what consciousness means, and what hydrogen means. Literally, consciousness means knowing together. Self-knowledge means to become more conscious, first of the different contradictory I's in us, our different moods, reactions, and so on, then to know them together. This signifies an increase of consciousness, in the sense of knowing together, as a holistic whole. Change of being can only take place through this method, through an increase of consciousness in this sense. The first conscious shock is the transformation of hydrogen-48 into hydrogen-24 by means of hydrogen-12. This has to be brought to the place of incoming impressions, where it acts as a carbon. Aim, if it is really emotionally felt, and can be remembered in a moment of difficulty, brings this carbon-12 into position. In a sense, This carbon is the entire emotional feeling and the valuation that an individual has towards the work itself. If the power to work is so great in a person that they do not forget it and feel that their whole life and all of its meaning is connected with it with some deep and sincere conviction, then this carbon-12 begins to assume its rightful position. However, if they are merely a creature of their own five senses, materialists, and sense-driven, then this transformation cannot be effected, and their life is, as it were, a manifestation of hydrogen-48, worldly affairs, happenstance, random, accidental and subjective things that just seem to occur for no clear, apparent reason, other than Mercury being in retrograde. If one can know together our mechanical reactions, through self-observation, and at the same time feel the presence of the work, then our consciousness is increased, in the sense that we know and feel together far more, we know and see our mechanicalness in the light of the work, and what it indicates, namely, we become conscious in the work, in the context of how we act in life, toward life, and so it can be said that we are conscious in a higher hydrogen. It is then necessary to think about what a hydrogen means. A hydrogen is a point in the universe, regarded on a qualitative scale, namely, a scale of degrees of excellence. The lower hydrogens are manifested to our external senses, as objects, as stones, as grass, as meat, as water, and so on. But when that point in the universe called hydrogen-48 is reached, its manifestation is only internal, and so has to do with states of consciousness. Hydrogen-48 is the lowest of the so-called psychic hydrogens. Our ordinary consciousness uses, as it were, hydrogen-48. It then sees everything in terms of opposites, as dualities, through yin and yang. The formatory part of the intellectual center, which works with hydrogen-48, is called third force blind. The range of knowledge given by this hydrogen determines the world of opposites for us, and so we see things as either yes or no, and are really incapable of relative thinking, incapable of seeing things outside of either affirming or denying them. Higher centers, which work with hydrogen-12 and hydrogen-6, contain no such contradictions. There is no negativity, no pushback and no resistance to anything because they are simply accepted as being. This is because the degree of illumination is such that we see all sides of a question simultaneously, and not divided into irreconcilable opposites. Sometimes consciousness is compared in the work system with light. Our inner life is said to be darkness, and this is what is meant in the Gospels by the words, people who live in darkness. The idea of self-observation is to let a ray of light into the darkness. We must imagine that to be conscious in a higher hydrogen, or by means of a higher hydrogen, is similar to having a greatly increased light that is shed on everything. Whereas the ray of a candle illuminates feebly the surroundings, the light of an arc lamp lights up what were mere shadows before, and makes us see everything in an entirely different relation. To be conscious in a higher hydrogen is to see entirely new relations, and this moment of seeing new relations sometimes occurs to us in times of trouble and distress, when suddenly everything becomes transformed, and we see things in an entirely different light. When we are fixed in our negative states, when we are full of self-pity, and only conscious of injured self-love, then we see everything very darkly. We are, in fact, conscious in hydrogen-48 as it were. But when we have a moment of awakening, and are lifted out of that state through the action of the work, all of our thoughts and emotions in that state now seem to be trivial. We cannot understand why we said this thing, or thought that thing, and felt in such a way. This is a moment of illumination, of increased light, and so increased consciousness, in the sense that we are knowing together far more than we do in our contracted state. Everything falls into its right proportion, in the light of this increased consciousness, so we can say that at that moment, we were conscious in a higher hydrogen. At such a moment, we are actually conscious at a higher point in the universe, regarded as a scale of qualities, and represented by hydrogens. Quite simply, we rise above ourselves for a moment, and see things from a different perspective. Everyone has noticed when they are in a worse state, or a better state, at different times of the day, and it is really upon the basis of this perfectly incontrovertible experience that we can become certain of the existence of higher degrees of consciousness. It is misleading, however, to try to connect the four given states of consciousness with hydrogens, and the two ideas should be considered separately, although obviously they are connected. The third state of consciousness, which is self-awareness, or self-remembering, always arises from a higher hydrogen, but it may be hydrogen-24, or hydrogen-12, or even, very rarely, hydrogen-6. Anesthetic revelation, with gases such as nitrous oxide, where people suddenly have an out-of-body experience and cannot remember it afterwards, are moments of consciousness from a higher hydrogen. Opium has a higher hydrogen in it, which people can become conscious of sometimes. This was the basis of psychedelics experimentation in the 1960s, and is like becoming conscious within the plant. All stimulants, all higher natures of plants, such as coffee, mushrooms, ayahuasca, or tobacco, can temporarily invoke these states, by varying degrees. We know, however, that if a person wants this to become permanent, they must then create higher hydrogens in themselves, by trying to give themselves the first conscious shock, and, if they can, the second conscious shock, which sets in motion new octaves in the development of all hydrogens in their body. It should be possible, therefore, to gain some understanding of the universe as a scale of hydrogens, which has to do with intensities of meaning and use. It is qualitative and not quantitative assessment. It is felt, rather than being touched. Reflect upon this, and then cast your eyes around you. See different things, made of wood, made of stone, perhaps some food on the table, water, air, and so on. Have you ever thought what relation all these different things have towards one another? If you have, then you may see why, when P.D. Ouspensky first heard of the table of hydrogens, he remarked that this was knowledge from higher centers. Everything is defined by what it eats, by what eats it. The cow can eat the flowers from the vase on the table, but you cannot. However, we can of course eat the cow, and drink its milk. Insects can eat the wood of the chair that we are sitting on. The wood of the chair we are sitting on is a certain point in the universe. Meat is more highly organized, and is a different point in the universe. Its functions, its properties, its uses, its possibilities, are all entirely different. Now take everyday human thought, based on hydrogen-48, its uses, its properties, its functions, are entirely different from those of meat, and yet it has its properties. Meat is cleverer, as it is said, than wood, and thought is then cleverer than meat. A cooked potato is cleverer than a raw potato, because it is 768 and can be eaten by man. Emotional perception, if it is really based on hydrogen-24, is far more clever than perception based on hydrogen-48. Have you ever reflected upon the difference between a quantitative view of the universe and a qualitative view of the universe? It is quite simple. Mathematics cannot deal with qualities, but only with quantities. Take basic quantities. Will any quantities of 1-cent coins make one golden coin? No. But by human agreement, that is, by establishing an artificial transforming system, 120,000 cents theoretically can be turned into an American gold eagle. However, unless such a human arrangement, unless such an artificially agreed upon monetary system existed, this could never happen, through the mere factor of quantities alone. Someone might accumulate millions of 1-cent coins, but no gold would result from any effort of that sort alone, unless the bank agreed to transform each bag of 120,000 cents into a golden eagle. So if we lived in a merely quantitative universe, no transformation would be possible, because transformation is a question of qualities, of qualitative differences, of one thing turning into something else. This work teaches that we live in a world of real qualitative differences, and this is its meaning. Transformation is possible, in the very nature of things. We see a seed transforming itself into a tree, but scarcely think of the miracle this involves. We eat meat and vegetables, and from this, the substances necessary for thought, feeling and love are created, through the transformation of a lower hydrogen into higher hydrogens. This is the inherent nature of the universe. What we call life is based upon the power of transforming, in a universe that is, itself, based upon transformation, of lower and higher, and so of endless qualitative differences. Life is transformation. In a universe having this nature or significance, transformation means the turning of something lower into something higher. The octave of food in the body shows this. All this connects itself with the basic idea of this work, that we live in a growing, evolving, and so transforming universe, a living and so transforming universe, or universe of transformation. Unless this is understood and felt, more and more deeply, the emotional center in us cannot awaken and develop, so soon deteriorates, slipping backward into chaos and darkness. As we all know, science teaches that we live in a dying universe. This system, this work, teaches quite the opposite. However, we must reflect for ourselves upon the psychological difference and the emotional value of these two views, then judge between their power for good or bad. Although religion, in the broadest sense, has taught something positive, perhaps in terms of a hereafter and so on, but if we consider for a moment the psychological difference, we can decide which is the more valuable. And we can see for ourselves that transformation exists on all sides. All life exists physically, by transforming a lower into a higher hydrogen, which means, we eat food, ch28, and so are able to think, ch48. All these ideas are in a way obvious, once we begin to think for ourselves, once the driver in us awakens, and climbs up onto the box of the carriage to take the reins in both hands. Unless we begin to think for ourselves, with the help of this work, we remain asleep, and life then exerts a force over us that is not necessary, and therefore contrary to our real destiny. The idea that all life is based upon transformation is obvious physically, that to overlook this would be the consequence of some mental blindness, or a deliberate aversion to ascribing meaning in anything, which is a common modern disease, leading to negative emotion by and of itself. In examining effort in the work, it becomes obvious that the mere quantity of effort is useless, in comparison with the quality of the effort. Simply lip service, and a gross imitation of work, or pretending to work and trying to attract merit, all such efforts, however amassed in quantity, lead to nothing, because such efforts are insincere. They are of bad faith, however great their volume might be. This work is based upon inner sincerity. One effort arising out of inner sincerity, an unshakable valuation of the work, will produce a change of being, and shift our position in the universe, because it is qualitative, different from any quantity of external, insincere, and weak effort. That is why in this work, people are brought to a point of decision. Which means that everything external, at a certain point will go against them, and there they find plenty to complain about, criticism and other external reasonings, plenty of justification for finding fault with others and so on. This point may be artificially created, if it does not inevitably arise as usually happens. Then everything depends upon whether the work has become born in us, and is truly internal. Then if so, the effort made at such a moment actually leads to change of being, to a new growth of essence, because then the necessary effort must be at the expense of personality. We have to reach a point in the work, when however we are turned or twisted, we never lose sight of our aim. Here our attitude to the work comes in, to this eternal work. Such a moment demands the most qualitative sincere effort, and if our attitude is shallow, then we shall not meet it. Reflect for a moment upon what this means, and upon what this work is based, wholly on inner change, and all that means, even if you have not thought of it before. Change is not addition, but actual change of the kind of person one is, and therefore painful. Only the sincerest moments are of use to us. Nothing false, in the way of effort is any good. The very fact that the universe is a scale of qualities, shows everyone that what is intrinsically false, cannot lead to any change, but must necessarily, by order of laws, find its own level, and remain there because it is what it is. Whatever a thing is, it is where it is in the universe, regarded as a scale of qualities, and must remain where it is, by reason of actual laws, which determine the position of everything according to its quality. This is what a qualitative view of the universe means. This is the meaning of the table of hydrogens, which is based upon feeling.